April 8, 1943. 27,000 feet above Caen, France. The oxygen mask couldn't hide Oberleutnant Ralph Hermiken's smirk as he scanned the horizon through the glass canopy of his Focke-Wulf 190A5. The German ace, a veteran of Jagerschwader 26, had seen his share of desperate skies. But today felt different. Below, the scattered clouds glowed gold in the morning sun. Ahead, distant contrails began to rise, ungainly shapes climbing toward his formation with uncertain rhythm. He narrowed his eyes. The Americans were here. For the Luftwaffe pilots, these new intruders were a curiosity, large, stubby aircraft that seemed far too heavy to maneuver with any grace. Thunderbolts, they were called. The name fit their presence, but their design invited mockery. Yet as the minutes passed, that mockery would turn into something else entirely. As Hermiken's flight dove toward the Americans, expecting an easy victory, he soon realized the skies had changed. What met him wasn't fear, it was defiance. The first P-47s, though bulky, carried an unmatched ferocity. When the Luftwaffe pilots dove upon them, they found their machine guns bouncing harmlessly off the American armor. The Thunderbolt's radial engine, massive, growling, built to endure punishment, absorbed bullets that would have torn lesser planes apart. And when those 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns spoke in return, they didn't whisper. They roared, spitting a wall of lead that shredded anything in their path. The air trembled under that firepower, the kind of sound that turned the tide of confidence in the minds of every pilot who faced it. But this was no ordinary battle in the air. It was a test, a clash between design philosophies, between speed and strength, agility and endurance. The Germans relied on quick strikes, precision maneuvers, and surgical attacks. The Americans countered with sheer resilience and overwhelming force. When Hermiken's wingman, Hans Reiter, dove to attack, he found his bullets glancing off the Thunderbolt's fuselage. The next instant, his canopy filled with light as a burst from the American guns ripped through his wing, sending him spiraling toward the French countryside below. One moment, predator. The next, prey. Still, the Thunderbolt wasn't born a legend. In its early days, many American pilots cursed its size. They called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, a machine that looked too heavy to fight. But as missions grew longer and the enemy more relentless, its true purpose revealed itself. It could dive faster than almost any fighter in the sky, withstand damage that would doom others, and deliver punishment across hundreds of miles. In the vast air war over Europe, where survival depended not just on skill but on engineering, the P-47 proved that brute strength could be beautiful. Each flight over occupied territory carried both fear and faith. Pilots knew the dangers. They watched comrades vanish into clouds of smoke, but they trusted their machine. When tracer rounds lit up the sky, the Thunderbolt didn't flinch. It climbed, rolled, and fought back. And for the Germans, that was the most terrifying sight of all, an enemy that refused to fall. By summer, rumors spread through Luftwaffe squadrons. Some claimed the Americans had built planes that couldn't be destroyed. Others said the Thunderbolts carried the spirit of their fallen allies. Whatever the truth, one fact became undeniable. The sky was no longer theirs alone. From the fields of Normandy to the ruins of Berlin, the growl of the P-47 became the anthem of Allied dominance, a sound that meant resistance, retribution, and revenge. The war was changing. And in that change, amidst smoke and fire, the legend of the Thunderbolt was born. As the months rolled forward, the skies above Europe turned into an endless battlefield of metal and fire. The Allied bombers, carrying the weight of a continent's hope, began their deadly marches toward the heart of Nazi Germany. Their paths were long and unforgiving, stretching hundreds of miles across enemy territory where flak and fighters waited like hungry wolves. In the early days, many never made it home. But that changed when the Thunderbolts arrived, not as lone warriors this time, but as guardians. The P-47s began escorting the massive B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators deep into German airspace. Their mission was clear: keep the bombers alive at all costs. And they did. The Luftwaffe pilots, once confident and ruthless, found themselves in a nightmare they couldn't escape. Whenever they rose to intercept, the Thunderbolts descended from above, their engines screaming, their guns roaring. Within moments, the hunters became the hunted. Dogfights erupted at altitudes where the air itself seemed to freeze, where every breath could be your last. And yet, through that chaos, the P-47 pilots pressed forward, relentless, unshakable, almost mechanical in their focus. Every bullet, every maneuver, every dive carried the same unspoken message. This war would not be won by fear. The Germans soon realized that fighting the Thunderbolts was like trying to stop a storm with bare hands. They could outturn them, sometimes even outclimb them, but they could never outlast them. The P-47's rugged design absorbed hits that shattered lighter planes, its engine refusing to quit even with holes punched through its frame. Pilots returned home with stories of oil leaking, wings torn, yet engines still growling until they touched the runway. It wasn't just an aircraft anymore, it was a lifeline. But behind every machine, there was a man. Young pilots, many barely out of their teens, strapped themselves into those cockpits knowing full well that one mistake could be their last. They carried tokens from home, a photo, a letter, a prayer, and they fought not just for victory, but for survival. Their courage burned brighter than tracer fire in the night sky. Some never returned, their names lost to the clouds. Yet, in every sortie, in every mission, their legacy grew stronger. The Thunderbolt had become a symbol of those who refused to back down, who took the fight to the enemy no matter the odds. By late 1944, the transformation was complete. The Luftwaffe was no longer the master of Europe's skies. German pilots began flying with caution, scanning the horizon not for opportunities, but for survival. The balance of air power had shifted, and with it, the rhythm of the war itself. Villages below could hear the distant rumble of engines, and they knew what it meant. The Americans were coming. Each formation of P-47s that streaked across the sky carried the promise of liberation for some, and the shadow of destruction for others. And yet, for all its might, the Thunderbolt remained humble in appearance, stout, heavy, unrefined. It wasn't elegant like the Spitfire or graceful like the Mustang, but perhaps that was its greatest strength. It represented the raw, unyielding determination of a nation at war, built not for beauty but for victory. In its metal skin and roaring heart lived the spirit of those who fought for something far greater than themselves. By winter, the P-47 had become more than a fighter, it was a declaration. A message written across the skies in smoke and flame. And though the war was far from over, one thing had become clear: the Allies now owned the daylight. By the spring of 1944, the roar of the Thunderbolt had become more than just a sound of aerial dominance. It was the drumbeat of Allied momentum. From the beaches of Normandy to the rolling fields of occupied France, its shadow stretched across the land like a storm that refused to fade. The Luftwaffe was crumbling, its aces dwindling, its aircraft grounded by shortages of fuel and fear alike. But the P-47's mission was far from finished. What began as an escort fighter was now transforming into something far deadlier, a flying hammer built to crush anything that moved beneath it. The Thunderbolt's immense frame, once seen as a disadvantage, became its greatest asset in the ground attack role. Fitted with bombs, rockets, and extra ammunition, it turned into an airborne tank, capable of unleashing hell on trains, convoys, and armored divisions. At low altitudes, its scream echoed across valleys as it dove toward enemy positions, releasing fire and steel with ruthless precision. German troops would scatter at the first hint of that distant thunder, knowing that once the P-47 appeared overhead, there was no hiding from its fury. Pilots became hunters in the truest sense. They sought out enemy columns, fuel depots, and bridges, tearing through them with relentless efficiency. Every sortie left behind trails of smoke and burning wreckage, a grim testament to the shifting balance of power. What made the Thunderbolt so terrifying wasn't just its firepower, but its resilience. Even at treetop level, where flak burst like black flowers in the air, it could take hit after hit and still climb back into the clouds. Many pilots returned with stories of holes big enough to see daylight through their wings, yet their engines refused to die. It was as if the machine itself was built to endure the punishment of war and deliver vengeance in return. By the time Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the P-47 had become indispensable. It was there when paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines, there when tanks pushed inland, and there when resistance fighters needed air support. The Germans had a name for it now, the Jug, a symbol of brute, unstoppable power. It didn't dance in the air like the sleek fighters of the past. It crushed, it tore, it dominated. And as the ground shook beneath its bombardments, even the most hardened German commanders began to whisper that the war was being lost from above. The pilots who flew these missions carried both pride and pain. They had seen what their weapons could do, trains filled with soldiers erupting into flames, convoys obliterated in seconds, villages turned to ash. War had stripped away the romance of flight and replaced it with something colder, heavier. Yet, there was no time for doubt. Each mission brought them closer to victory, and every successful strike meant one less obstacle for the men fighting below. The Thunderbolt had become the bridge between sky and earth, a guardian angel for some, a nightmare for others. By late summer, the European countryside was littered with the wreckage of what once was the pride of Hitler's war machine. Tanks that had once rolled confidently across Poland now burned helplessly in ditches. The skies, once ruled by the black crosses of the Luftwaffe, now belonged to the silver wings of the United States Army Air Forces. The roar of the P-47 had become the sound of inevitability, the sound of a world slowly turning toward freedom. But in war, even victory carries its shadows. Each mission came at a cost, friends lost, machines that never returned, lives exchanged for inches of progress. Yet through it all, one truth remained unshaken. The Thunderbolt was no longer just an aircraft. It had become a legend, forged in fire and destined to define the sky for generations to come. Winter descended over Europe like a heavy shroud. The once bright fields were buried under snow and silence, and yet, above the clouds, the war still raged. The roar of engines no longer carried the thrill of battle. It carried a weary determination, the sound of men who had fought too long, seen too much, and yet refused to stop. Among them flew the Thunderbolts, now the veterans of the sky. They were no longer the newcomers, no longer questioned or doubted. They were the standard, the iron backbone of Allied air power, carving paths of destruction wherever the front demanded. The Thunderbolt had become a symbol of inevitability. Each sortie it flew was a reminder to the Germans that resistance was futile. Its bombs shattered bridges, rail lines, and supply chains, choking the lifeblood of Hitler's armies. But more than that, it shattered morale. Soldiers on the ground began to dread the distant hum in the air, a low vibration that crawled across their nerves before the storm arrived. And when it did, the earth itself trembled beneath its fury. The P-47 wasn't just attacking, it was announcing that the end was coming. Inside the cockpit, however, the reality was far from triumphant. Pilots flew missions that tested every ounce of their willpower. The skies were cold, the air thin, and the fear constant. Anti-aircraft fire clawed at them from below, black puffs of death that could rip a wing apart in seconds. Many never made it back, vanishing into smoke and cloud. But those who survived carried scars, some on their bodies, most in their minds. They learned to live with the silence that followed each mission, the silence where names of lost friends echoed louder than the engines ever could. By early 1945, as the Allies pushed toward the heart of Germany, the Thunderbolt's role shifted once again. It became the spearhead of every advance, the guardian of every soldier below. When troops were pinned down by machine gun fire, the P-47 swooped in. When tanks rolled toward Allied lines, they answered with rockets and fury. And when cities resisted, they broke the gates wide open. The aircraft that once struggled to earn respect had now become the most feared presence in the European sky. In the words of one German officer captured near the Rhine, "We did not fear their soldiers, we feared their sky." It was a statement born not of surrender, but of truth. The P-47 had become the face of Allied air superiority, a relentless, mechanical beast that combined brute force with mechanical grace. And behind that power stood thousands of engineers, mechanics, and pilots who turned metal into a message. Freedom was coming, no matter the cost. As the war neared its bloody conclusion, the Thunderbolt flew its final missions over a shattered continent. Cities that once stood proud now lay in ruins. The pilots looked down upon landscapes forever scarred by conflict, realizing that victory came at a price no one could fully count. And yet, through the smoke, there was something else: hope. The same engines that had brought devastation now escorted food drops, medical supplies, and relief across liberated Europe. The same wings that once carried bombs now carried mercy. For the men who flew it, the Thunderbolt was more than a machine, it was a companion. It had carried them through storms of lead and fire, across skies filled with enemies, and back home against impossible odds. It was as if the aircraft itself understood what it meant to fight, to suffer, and to endure. And when the guns finally fell silent, it became clear that this wasn't just the story of a warplane. It was the story of resilience, of men and metal intertwined in the crucible of history. The guns had fallen silent. The skies that once echoed with the thunder of engines were now strangely still, like a world holding its breath after years of chaos. Across Europe, the ruins of cities whispered stories of sacrifice, courage, and loss. And high above those scarred lands, the shadow of the Thunderbolt faded into history, not as a symbol of destruction, but of endurance. The war was over, but its echoes remained, written across every dented fuselage, every bullet hole patched with trembling hands, every pilot stare that saw far more than the horizon. When peace finally returned, many P-47s were left behind in hangars, their metal bodies worn but unbroken. They had served their purpose with a kind of brutal grace, carrying young men into battles from which few returned unchanged. The world had moved on to faster, sleeker jets, machines built for a new age. Yet, to those who had lived beneath its wings, the Thunderbolt was irreplaceable. It wasn't just a weapon of war, it was a companion forged in fire, one that demanded respect and earned it in kind. Veterans spoke of it with the tone reserved for old friends, of how it saved them when everything else failed, how it kept flying when logic said it shouldn't. In post-war airshows, when a surviving P-47 roared back to life, people stopped to listen. The sound wasn't just nostalgia, it was remembrance. Every growl of that radial engine was a reminder of the thousands who had once soared into uncertain skies, driven by duty and faith. Children watched, unaware of the blood that once stained those wings. For them, it was history. For the men who flew it, it was memory. A living, breathing ghost of the past that refused to fade away. In time, historians would write about its impact in numbers, its tonnage of bombs dropped, its confirmed kills, its role in shaping the outcome of the war. But the true legacy of the Thunderbolt couldn't be captured by statistics. It lived in the unspoken connection between man and machine, in the courage it inspired and the lives it protected. For every German convoy it destroyed, there was an Allied soldier who lived to see another dawn. For every factory it silenced, there was a village that would one day rebuild in peace. The Thunderbolt was never just a tool of war. It was a bridge between destruction and deliverance. As the decades passed, fewer pilots remained to tell its story. Their voices grew quieter, their memories fading like contrails in the wind. But every once in a while, at an airfield somewhere, the old engine would start again. The same low rumble would rise, shaking the ground just as it did in 1944. And in that sound, deep, defiant, eternal, the spirit of the Thunderbolt lived on. It was the sound of resilience, of a generation that faced darkness and refused to bow. Today, when historians look back on the machines that changed the course of World War II, the P-47 stands among giants. It may not have been the fastest or the prettiest, but it was unstoppable, built not to impress, but to survive. Its story is the story of men who learned that courage isn't found in glory, it's found in endurance, in the will to rise again, no matter how heavy the sky becomes. And so, as the last light fades on the era of propellers and pistons, one truth remains carved into the history of flight. The Thunderbolt didn't just win battles. It embodied the strength of those who dared to fly through hell and make it back. The war may have ended, but legends like this never truly land. They just keep flying, forever.